Welcome. You have found your way here, to this quiet space at the end of the day. Let yourself settle. Let the weight of the hours behind you begin to fade. Tonight, we're going to journey into winter as it was lived in northern China, long before the arrival of electricity or gas. For thousands of years, families in these high plains and carved valleys endured months of cold that could kill. Temperatures fell far below freezing. Winds swept down from the steppes. Nights stretched long and dark. In this environment, warmth was not a convenience. It was survival. And yet, people did not merely endure. They developed systems that allowed them to sleep soundly through the coldest nights. Systems built from earth and fire, from routine and patience. There was no single invention that made this possible. It was a layering of many elements, each refined over generations, each depending on the others. Architecture became insulation. Cooking became heating. Social life arranged itself around the shared warmth of a single platform. Over the next hours, we will move slowly through this world. We will see how homes were built to hold heat, how fires were managed to last the night, how clothing became portable shelter. We will follow the logic of warmth from the ground beneath to the quilts above. So settle in. Let your breathing slow. The story will unfold at its own pace. The northern regions of China occupy a geography defined by extremes. The Les Plateau stretches across provinces like Shanxi and Shaanxi, a landscape shaped by wind over millennia. Here, fine silt carried from distant deserts settled in thick layers, creating a terrain of deep valleys and steep cliffs. The soil is soft enough to carve but stable enough to stand in vertical walls. Further north lie the plains that border the steppes, open and exposed. Winter winds arrive from Mongolia and Siberia with nothing to slow them. They sweep across flat farmland through villages into homes. Temperature drops are severe. In the depths of winter, the thermometer can fall to minus 20 degrees Celsius or lower. These are not brief cold snaps, but sustained conditions lasting weeks at a time. Frost penetrates deep into the ground. Rivers freeze solid. The air itself seems to harden. Daylight grows short. The sun rises late and sets early, offering only a few hours of weak warmth. Most of life happens in darkness or the grey light of early morning and dusk. In such a climate, the human body loses heat rapidly. Without protection, hypothermia sets in within hours. Sleep becomes dangerous. A person who falls asleep in the open cold may not wake. For the communities that made their homes in these regions, winter was not an occasional hardship but a recurring test. Every autumn, as temperatures began their descent, families knew what was coming. They had months to prepare and centuries of accumulated knowledge to guide them. Survival depended on solving a fundamental problem: how to maintain enough warmth through the night to allow the body to rest without freezing. The solutions they developed were not dramatic. They were methodical. They involved careful observation of how heat moves, how materials respond to temperature, how the earth itself can serve as insulation. These were sedentary agricultural societies. Their wealth was modest, their resources limited. Wood was scarce in many areas. Coal, when available, was expensive. Most families could not afford to burn fuel continuously through the night. What they had in abundance was time, patience, and the willingness to work with the materials at hand. They had low soil that could be shaped and carved. They had agricultural waste from the harvest. They had the knowledge passed down from parents and grandparents, refined through trial and error over countless winters. The result was a system that integrated the home, the fire, and the family into a single functional unit. Warmth was not something purchased or consumed. It was something created, shared, and carefully maintained. This system did not rely on any single technology. It was a combination of architectural design, fuel management, textile production, and social routine. Each element supported the others. Remove one, and the entire structure weakened. At the centre of it all was the recognition that the human body is itself a heat source. The challenge was not to generate vast amounts of warmth, but to trap and preserve the warmth already present, to slow its escape into the frozen night. In the chapters ahead, we will see how this was accomplished. We will begin with the Kang, the raised platform that served as both bed and heater. the foundation upon which the entire winter sleep experience was built. The Kang is difficult to describe to someone who has never seen one. It is not simply a bed. It is not simply a heater. It is both, fused into a single structure that occupies much of the living space in a traditional northern Chinese home. Imagine a platform raised about half a metre above the floor. It is built from masonry, from bricks or compressed earth. The surface is wide enough for an entire family to sleep on, sometimes 3 metres across or more. It is hard, not soft like a modern mattress, but covered with mats and quilts to provide cushioning. This platform is hollow inside. Within it runs a network of channels, passages carved through the masonry in a deliberate pattern. These channels are called the Kangdao, the Kang's pathways. At one end of the platform, usually the end closest to the kitchen, there is an opening. This opening connects directly to the cooking stove. When a fire is lit in the stove to prepare a meal, the hot smoke does not rise immediately up a chimney. Instead, it is directed into the Kang. The smoke enters the platform and travels through the internal channels. As it moves, it transfers its heat to the surrounding masonry. The earth and brick absorb this thermal energy, growing warm to the touch. By the time the smoke reaches the far end of the platform, it has surrendered most of its heat. It exits through a chimney located on the opposite wall, drawn upward by the natural draft. This process happens every time the family cooks. Morning and evening, when meals are prepared, the fire heats the Kang. The platform becomes a thermal battery, storing the energy for hours after the flames have gone out. The warmth radiates upward from the Kang's surface and outward into the room, but the effect is most concentrated on the platform itself. Anyone lying on the Kang receives heat through direct contact, through conduction. The body presses against the warm surface, and that warmth moves into the skin, the muscles, the core. This is radiant heating, not convective. The air in the room may remain quite cold, but the people on the Kang stay warm. It is an efficient use of limited fuel, targeting the heat exactly where it is needed. The Kang is not a luxury. In the northern regions, it is standard. Nearly every home has one. Wealthy families may have larger, more elaborate versions. Poor families make do with simpler construction. But the principle remains the same. It is the heart of the household. Families eat on the Kang, sitting cross-legged on its surface. They work there, mending clothes or sorting grain. They receive guests there, offering a seat on the warm platform as a gesture of hospitality. And at night, they sleep there, arranged according to a careful hierarchy. The Kang is also permanent. Once built, it is not moved. It is integrated into the structure of the house itself, part of the walls and the foundation. To build a home in the north is to build a Kang. The two are inseparable. This permanence reflects the Kang's importance. It is not furniture, it is infrastructure. It is the means by which the family survives the winter, year after year, generation after generation. The Kang also shapes the rhythm of daily life, because it relies on the cooking fire for heat. Meals become moments of preparation for sleep. The evening meal is not just about food. It is about warming the bed. The timing of cooking, the duration of the fire, the amount of fuel used, all of these are calibrated to ensure that the Kang will remain warm through the night. In summer, when heating is not needed, the smoke can be redirected to bypass the Kang entirely, venting straight up the chimney. The platform becomes simply a raised surface, cooler than the surrounding air. But in winter, the smoke must pass through. The family's comfort depends on it. The design of the Kang is deceptively simple. It is a box with channels inside and a fire at one end. Yet this simplicity is the result of centuries of refinement. The width of the channels, the thickness of the walls, the height of the platform, the placement of the chimney, all of these have been optimized through generations of use. A poorly built Kang does not heat evenly. Some areas become too hot, uncomfortable to lie on. Other areas remain cold. Smoke may leak into the room, causing respiratory problems or even carbon monoxide poisoning. The draft may fail, and the fire will not draw properly. A well-built Kang, by contrast, provides steady, even warmth. It requires minimal fuel. It produces no smoke in the living area. It lasts for years with only minor maintenance. The knowledge of how to build such a Kang is not written down in manuals. It is held in the hands and minds of craftsmen, passed from master to apprentice, from father to son. It is practical knowledge, learned through observation and repetition. This is vernacular architecture in its truest sense. It is not designed by architects or engineers in the modern sense. It is designed by the people who use it, refined by the people who live with it, adapted to the specific materials and conditions of the region. The Kang, then, is more than a heating device. It is a physical manifestation of accumulated wisdom, technology that emerged from necessity and was perfected through patience. In the next chapter, we will trace its origins, following its evolution from the earliest forms to the standardized structures of the imperial era. The Kang did not appear suddenly. It evolved slowly over many centuries. The earliest evidence of heated sleeping platforms in China dates back more than 2,000 years to the Han Dynasty. During this period, which began in 206 BCE and lasted until 220 CE, the northern regions were already inhabited by communities familiar with severe winters. Archaeological excavations have uncovered remnants of what appear to be early heating systems. These were not yet the raised platforms we recognise as Kangs, but simpler structures. Fire pits were dug into the ground, and channels were carved to direct smoke along the base of walls or beneath earthen floors. Historical texts from this era mention fire walls, surfaces warmed by the passage of smoke through hollow spaces. These were used in palaces and official buildings, where the need for warmth was combined with the resources to experiment with construction. The principle was already understood. Heat from combustion could be captured and stored in masonry, then released gradually. The challenge was refining the design to make it practical for ordinary households. During the centuries following the Han Dynasty, China experienced periods of fragmentation and upheaval. The north was often contested territory, subject to invasions and migrations. Yet through all this, the need for winter warmth persisted, and the technology continued to develop. By the Tang Dynasty, which began in 618 AD, the Kang had taken a recognizable form. This was the period when the raised platform became standard. Instead of embedding heating channels in the floor, builders began constructing elevated structures that could be more easily controlled and maintained. The Tang period also saw the integration of the cooking stove with the Kang. Previously, heating and cooking had been separate functions. Now they were combined. The kitchen stove, located at one end of the living area, became the heat source for the sleeping platform. This integration was a significant advance in efficiency. Every meal cooked was also a session of heating the bed. The design of the internal flue system, the Kangdao, became more sophisticated during the Song and Ming dynasties. Builders experimented with different patterns of channels, seeking to distribute heat more evenly across the platform. Some designs used parallel straight channels, others employed serpentine patterns, forcing the smoke to travel a longer path and surrender more heat before exiting. The materials also improved. Early Kangs were often built from tamped earth, which was abundant and easy to work with, but not particularly durable. Over time, fired bricks became more common, especially in areas with access to clay. Brick Kangs were more stable, less prone to cracking, and better at storing heat. By the Qing dynasty, which began in 1644 and lasted until 1912, the Kang had become a standardized feature of northern architecture. It appeared not only in rural farmhouses but also in urban residences and even imperial palaces. The Qing court constructed warm pavilions in the Forbidden City, buildings designed specifically for winter occupancy. These pavilions used the same basic principle as the rural Kang, but on a much larger scale. Entire rooms were heated by networks of flues running beneath the floor and inside the walls. Architects of the Qing period also developed guidelines for optimal Kang construction. They calculated the ideal ratio of Kang surface area to room volume, seeking to balance warmth with the structural demands of the building. They specified the thickness of the platform walls, the diameter of the flue channels, the height of the chimney. These guidelines were not rigid rules but accumulated recommendations, the distilled experience of generations. They were adapted to local conditions, to the availability of materials, to the specific needs of each household. Throughout this long history, the Kang remained fundamentally the same. It was a raised masonry platform with internal channels for smoke, heated by the cooking fire. The refinements were incremental, not revolutionary. Each generation made small improvements, and these improvements accumulated over time. This gradual evolution is characteristic of vernacular technology. There is no single inventor of the Kang, no moment of breakthrough. It is the product of countless anonymous craftsmen, each contributing a slight modification, each testing and adjusting based on lived experience. The continuity of the Kang across dynasties also reflects the continuity of the problem it solved. Winter in northern China was no less severe in the Qing dynasty than it had been in the Han. The fundamental challenge, how to sleep warmly with limited fuel, remained constant. So the solution remained constant as well, refined but not replaced. By the time of the late imperial period, the Kang was so deeply embedded in northern culture that it was difficult to imagine life without it. It shaped the layout of homes, the rhythm of daily routines, the social interactions of the family. It was simply the way things were done. In the next chapter, we will examine how the Kang actually worked, breaking down the thermal axis that made it so effective. To understand the Kang fully, we must follow the path of heat from its source to its release. This path forms what can be called the thermal axis, a continuous flow of energy through three critical components: the cooking stove, the Kang platform, and the chimney. Each component has a specific role, and the system functions only when all three are properly aligned. The axis begins with the stove, known as the zao. In traditional northern homes, the stove is located in the kitchen area, which is often a separate room or a partitioned section adjacent to the main living space. The stove itself is a masonry structure, built from brick or stone, with a firebox at the base and cooking surfaces on top. The firebox is where the fuel is burned. This fuel is not wood in most cases, as wood is scarce on the northern plains. Instead, families burn agricultural waste, dried corn stalks, wheat chaff, millet husks, prunings from fruit trees. These materials are gathered during the harvest season and stored carefully for winter use. When the fire is lit, it produces heat and smoke. The heat is immediate, used for cooking. The smoke, however, is not allowed to escape directly. It is channeled into the Kang through an opening at the base of the stove. This opening is deliberately positioned. It must be large enough to allow the smoke to flow freely, but small enough to maintain the draft needed for combustion. If the opening is too large, the fire will not burn efficiently. If it is too small, the smoke will back up into the kitchen. From the opening, the smoke enters the Kang. The platform is hollow, as we have seen, with internal passages that guide the smoke across its width. These passages are not random. They are laid out in a specific pattern designed to maximize heat transfer. In some Kangs, the passages run in parallel lines from one end to the other. In others, they form a zigzag or spiral, forcing the smoke to travel a longer distance. The longer the path, the more heat is transferred to the masonry before the smoke exits. As the smoke moves through the channels, it is in direct contact with the walls of the passages. These walls are made of materials with high thermal mass: earth, brick, or clay. Thermal mass is the ability of a material to absorb and store heat. The greater the mass, the more energy can be held. The smoke is hot, often several hundred degrees Celsius as it leaves the firebox. The masonry, by contrast, is initially cool. Heat flows naturally from hot to cold, so the energy transfers from the smoke to the walls. The walls warm up, and the smoke cools down. This process is gradual. As the smoke travels through the channels, it steadily loses temperature. By the time it reaches the far end of the Kang, it may be only slightly warmer than the surrounding air. At this point, the smoke exits the Kang and enters the chimney. The chimney is usually built into the exterior wall of the house, positioned as far as possible from the stove. This distance ensures that the smoke has travelled the full length of the Kang, extracting maximum heat. The chimney serves two functions. First, it vents the smoke safely out of the house, preventing it from accumulating in the living area. Second, it creates a draft. As the hot smoke rises up the chimney, it draws fresh air into the firebox, sustaining the combustion. The effectiveness of the draft depends on the height and diameter of the chimney. A taller chimney produces a stronger draft, but it must be balanced against the structural demands of the building. A chimney that is too wide will allow the smoke to cool too quickly, reducing the draft. A chimney that is too narrow will restrict flow, causing smoke to back up. These variables are carefully calibrated during construction. The builder must consider the size of the firebox, the length of the Kang, the volume of the room, the local climate. There are no universal formulas, only guidelines adapted to each situation. Once the system is in place, the thermal axis operates with minimal intervention. The family lights the fire to cook a meal. The smoke heats the Kang as it passes through. The chimney draws the smoke away. The process is automatic, requiring no additional effort. The heat stored in the Kang radiates upward and outward. It warms the surface of the platform, which is where people sit and sleep. It also warms the air immediately above the platform, creating a layer of warmer air in the lower part of the room. This is radiant heating, as opposed to convective heating. In convective heating, the air itself is warmed, and the warm air circulates throughout the space. In radiant heating, the warmth is transferred directly from a hot surface to the objects or people in contact with it. Radiant heating is more efficient for the Kang's purpose. It allows the platform to be warm, while the air in the room remains relatively cool. This reduces the amount of fuel needed, as there is no attempt to heat the entire volume of the house. The thermal axis is elegant in its simplicity. It takes a necessary activity, cooking, and repurposes its byproduct, smoke, to perform a second function, heating. Nothing is wasted. The energy from the fire serves two purposes simultaneously. This efficiency is central to the Kang's success. In an environment where fuel is limited, every bit of energy must be used to its fullest. The thermal axis accomplishes this without complexity, without moving parts, without any need for maintenance beyond the occasional cleaning of soot from the channels. In the next chapter, we will look more closely at what happens after the fire goes out, at how the Kang continues to provide warmth long into the night. The fire in the stove does not burn all night. Fuel is too precious for that. The family cannot afford to keep the fire going continuously, especially through the long winter months when every bundle of corn stalks must be rationed. Instead, the fire is lit twice a day, in the morning and in the evening, when meals are prepared. Each session lasts only an hour or two, just long enough to cook the food. Then the fire is allowed to die down, and the embers are banked for the next use. This would seem to present a problem. If the fire goes out in the evening, how does the Kang stay warm through the night? The answer lies in thermal mass. Thermal mass is the property of a material to absorb heat and release it slowly over time. Materials with high thermal mass, like stone, brick, and compacted earth, can store large amounts of energy. Once heated, they cool down very gradually, releasing their stored warmth over hours or even days. The Kang is built entirely from such materials. The walls of the internal channels, the floor of the platform, the top surface, all are made of earth or brick. These materials have been chosen specifically for their ability to hold heat. When the smoke from the cooking fire passes through the Kang, it heats the masonry to a temperature significantly higher than the surrounding air. The surface of the Kang may reach 15 or even 20 degrees Celsius, warm to the touch, but not uncomfortably hot. This warmth does not disappear when the fire goes out. The masonry continues to hold the heat, releasing it slowly into the room and into the bodies of the people lying on the platform. The rate of release depends on the temperature difference between the Kang and its surroundings. If the room is very cold, the heat escapes more quickly. If the room is relatively warm, the heat is retained longer. But in either case, the process is gradual. A well-built Kang can remain warm for 6 to 8 hours after the fire has been extinguished. This is long enough to carry the family through the night. They go to sleep on a warm surface, and they wake in the morning to a surface that is still noticeably warmer than the air around them. This delayed release of heat is what makes the Kang practical. Without thermal mass, the platform would cool down within an hour of the fire going out, and the family would freeze. With thermal mass, the platform becomes a reservoir of warmth, sustaining the household until the next fire is lit. The physics of this process are straightforward. Heat is a form of energy. When the smoke transfers energy to the masonry, that energy is stored in the molecular structure of the material. The molecules vibrate more rapidly, and this increased vibration is what we experience as warmth. Over time, the molecules transfer some of their energy to the surrounding air and to any objects in contact with the surface. This transfer continues until the temperature equalizes, until the Kang is no longer warmer than its environment. But because the mass of the Kang is large, and because the transfer of heat is relatively slow, this equalization takes many hours. The Kang acts as a buffer, smoothing out the temperature fluctuations between the brief periods when the fire is burning and the long periods when it is not. This is fundamentally different from modern heating systems, which operate continuously or cycle on and off to maintain a constant air temperature. The Kang does not attempt to keep the room warm. It keeps the bed warm, which is all that is needed for sleep. The distinction is important. Heating an entire room requires far more energy than heating a single surface. The Kang is a targeted solution, concentrating warmth exactly where it is needed and letting the rest of the space remain cool. This zonal approach to heating is part of what made the Kang sustainable. Families could survive the winter on a modest supply of fuel, enough to cook their meals and in doing so, warm their bed. They did not need vast stockpiles of wood or coal. They worked with what they had, and they made it sufficient. The Kang also allowed people to tolerate lower ambient temperatures. Because they were in direct contact with a warm surface, they could sleep comfortably even when the air in the room was near freezing. The warmth came not from breathing warm air, but from lying on warm earth. This principle, radiant heat rather than convective heat, is central to understanding the Kang. It is why the system worked with so little fuel and why it remained in use for so many centuries. The thermal mass of the Kang also contributed to its durability. Because the platform was built from solid masonry, it could withstand the daily cycle of heating and cooling without cracking or degrading. Modern materials, which expand and contract more dramatically with temperature changes, would not have lasted as long. The builders of the Kang understood these properties intuitively. They did not need to know the physics of heat transfer or the molecular theory of thermal mass. They knew from experience that thick walls of earth stayed warm longer than thin walls, that a large platform held heat better than a small one, that certain patterns of channels distributed warmth more evenly than others. This knowledge was tested every winter. If a Kang failed to keep the family warm, the design was adjusted. If it worked well, the design was repeated. Over generations, the failures were forgotten, and the successes became standard practice. The result was a technology that functioned reliably, season after season, with minimal maintenance and no external inputs beyond the daily cooking fire. In the next chapter, we will see how a Kang was actually built, the process by which this accumulated knowledge was translated into physical form. The construction of a Kang was not a task undertaken lightly. It required skill, experience, and an understanding of principles that were never written down. In most villages, there were one or two people known for their ability to build Kangs that worked well, that heated evenly, that lasted for years without needing repair. These builders were not formally trained. They had learned by watching their fathers or uncles, by assisting with constructions from a young age, by making mistakes and correcting them. The knowledge lived in their hands, in their ability to judge the consistency of clay, the proper angle of a flue, the right thickness for a wall. When a family decided to build a new home or repair an old Kang, they would call upon such a person. The builder would arrive and assess the space, considering the size of the room, the location of the cooking stove, the availability of materials. The first step was to establish the footprint of the platform. The Kang needed to be large enough to accommodate the family, but not so large that it would be difficult to heat evenly. A typical Kang measured about 2 meters deep and 3 to 4 meters wide, occupying roughly a third of the room. The base was constructed directly on the packed earth floor. In some cases, a shallow foundation was dug to provide stability. Stones or broken bricks were laid as a foundation layer, creating a level surface on which to build. The walls of the Kang were then raised. These walls formed the outer shell of the platform and also divided the interior into channels. The material used depended on what was available locally. In areas with good clay, fired bricks were preferred. In regions where clay was scarce, unfired adobe bricks made from loess soil mixed with straw were used instead. Adobe bricks had certain advantages. They were inexpensive, made from materials that could be dug from the ground nearby. They were also excellent at storing heat, as the compressed earth had high thermal mass. The straw mixed into the clay provided some structural reinforcement, preventing the bricks from cracking as they dried. The disadvantage of adobe was durability. Over time, the constant heating and cooling would cause the bricks to become brittle. They would absorb moisture from the air, especially in spring and autumn when humidity was higher. Eventually, they would crumble and need to be replaced. Fired bricks were more durable but also more expensive. They required a kiln and fuel for firing, resources that not every family could afford. In practice, many Kangs used a combination, with fired bricks for the most critical load-bearing sections and adobe for the interior channels. As the walls rose, the builder laid out the Kangdao, the internal flue system. This was the most critical part of the construction, the element that determined whether the Kang would heat evenly or not. The channels needed to be wide enough for smoke to flow freely, but not so wide that the smoke would rush through without transferring heat. A typical channel was about 10 to 15 centimeters across. The height varied depending on the overall design, but it was usually between 15 and 20 centimeters. The pattern of the channels was chosen based on the builder's judgment. Some preferred a simple parallel design, with several straight channels running from the stove end to the chimney end. Others favoured a serpentine pattern, where the smoke was forced to turn back on itself multiple times, lengthening its path and increasing heat transfer. There was no single correct pattern. Different designs worked better in different situations. A small Kang might need only 2 or 3 channels. A large Kang might require 5 or 6. The builder had to visualise how the smoke would flow, where it might stagnate, where it might move too quickly. Once the channels were laid out, they were covered with flat stones or bricks to form the top surface of the Kang. This surface had to be strong enough to support the weight of multiple people, but thin enough to allow heat to pass through easily. The thickness of the top layer was typically about 5 to 8 centimeters. Thicker would insulate too much, reducing the warmth felt on the surface. Thinner would risk cracking under the weight of bodies and bedding. After the top layer was in place, it was covered with several coats of clay plaster. This plaster smoothed out the irregularities, filled any gaps, and created a sealed surface that would not leak smoke into the room. The plaster was applied wet, and then allowed to dry slowly over several days. The final step was to build the connection to the stove and the chimney. The stove opening had to align precisely with the entry point of the Kang. If there was a gap, smoke would escape into the kitchen. If the opening was too tight, the flow would be restricted. The chimney was built up from the far end of the Kang, rising through the wall to the exterior. The height of the chimney affected the draft. A taller chimney pulled harder, creating a stronger flow of smoke through the channels. But a chimney that was too tall might pull too hard, drawing the heat out before it could be absorbed by the masonry. The builder adjusted these elements based on experience, on the feel of the draft when a test fire was lit. Adjustments were made by adding or removing bricks, by widening or narrowing openings, by changing the angle of the chimney. Once completed, the Kang needed to cure. The clay plaster had to dry fully, and the entire structure had to settle. This took several weeks. During this time, small fires were lit to gradually heat the masonry, preventing thermal shock that could cause cracking. The first full winter with a new Kang was a test. The family would discover whether it heated evenly, whether smoke leaked, whether the draft was sufficient. If problems arose, the builder would return to make repairs, adjusting the design until it worked properly. A well-built Kang could last for decades with only minor maintenance, but it was not permanent. Over time, the adobe bricks would degrade, the plaster would crack, the channels would fill with soot. Eventually, the Kang would need to be torn down and rebuilt. This cycle of construction and reconstruction was part of the rhythm of life. Every 10 or 15 years, the Kang was dismantled. The old bricks were not discarded. They had value, a value that became apparent in the next chapter. When a Kang was torn down, the old adobe bricks were carefully collected. These bricks were not thrown away. They were carried to the fields and spread across the soil, where they would be crushed and worked into the earth as fertilizer. This practice might seem strange at first. Bricks are not typically thought of as fertilizer, but these particular bricks had been subjected to years of heat and smoke. They had absorbed not just thermal energy, but also the chemical residues of combustion. The smoke that passed through the Kang came from burning agricultural waste, corn stalks, wheat chaff, wood ash. This smoke contained minerals, potassium, phosphorus, calcium, that had been part of the plants grown in the fields. When the smoke cooled inside the Kang channels, these minerals settled as soot on the surface of the adobe. Over months and years, the adobe absorbed this soot. The bricks became saturated with it, darkened by it. The constant heating also altered the structure of the clay itself, making it more friable, easier to break apart. When the Kang was dismantled, these bricks were rich in nutrients. Farmers recognized this. They knew that spreading old Kang bricks on the fields improved the soil, increased the yield of the next harvest. The process was simple. The bricks were broken into chunks with a hammer, or allowed to crumble naturally. The chunks were scattered over the ploughed fields before planting. Rain and frost gradually broke them down further, releasing the minerals into the soil. This created a closed loop. The plants grown in the fields were harvested. The stalks and chaff were dried and used as fuel. The fuel heated the Kang and was reduced to ash and smoke. The smoke deposited minerals in the adobe. The adobe was returned to the fields. The minerals nourished the next generation of plants. Nothing was wasted. Every part of the cycle had a purpose. The Kang was not just a device for sleeping, but a component in the larger system of agricultural sustainability. This loop also meant that the Kang had to be rebuilt periodically. As the bricks degraded, they became less effective at storing heat. Cracks would form, allowing smoke to leak into the room. The structure would become unstable. Rebuilding was not a crisis, but a planned event. Families knew that a Kang had a lifespan, and they prepared for its renewal. The timing was often coordinated with other household projects, with the replastering of walls or the repair of the roof. The act of tearing down the old Kang and building a new one was also a form of knowledge transfer. Younger family members would assist, learning the techniques by doing. They would see how the channels were laid out, how the bricks were fitted together, how the surface was plastered. By the time they needed to build their own Kang, they would have watched the process multiple times. They would know what to do, not from instruction, but from observation and participation. This intergenerational transmission of skill was essential. Without it, the knowledge would have been lost. There were no written manuals, no diagrams. The design of the Kang existed only in the minds and hands of those who built it. The fertility loop also reflected a broader philosophy of resource use. In traditional agricultural societies, waste was a concept with little meaning. Everything had a use. If only you knew what it was. Ash from the stove was used to make lye for washing clothes. Broken pottery was ground up and mixed into mortar. Worn-out textiles were unravelled and respun. The household operated on principles of conservation and reuse, driven by necessity but refined into habit. The Kang fit seamlessly into this system. It was not an isolated technology, but part of a web of practices that sustained the family through the year. The fire that cooked the food warmed the bed. The bed's spent bricks nourished the crops. The crops provided fuel for the fire. Each element reinforced the others. Remove one, and the whole system weakened. The Kang could not function without agricultural waste for fuel. The fields could not sustain their fertility without the minerals from the Kang. The family could not survive the winter without the Kang's warmth. This interdependence was rarely articulated. It was simply how things were done, the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned to live within the limits of their environment. In a modern context, this cycle offers a model of efficiency that is striking. The Kang did not consume resources in a linear fashion, taking in fuel and producing waste. It participated in a circular economy, where outputs from one process became inputs for another. The energy embedded in the plant material was used twice, first as heat for cooking and warming, then as nutrients for the next season's growth. The labour of building the Kang was spread over years, and the materials from its eventual dismantling were reintegrated into the productive cycle. This efficiency was not planned in any centralised way. It emerged from the constraints of the environment and the ingenuity of people working within those constraints. They could not afford to waste anything, so they found uses for everything. The result was a system that could sustain itself indefinitely, as long as the climate remained stable and the social structures remained intact. It was resilient, adaptable, and deeply rooted in place. In the next chapter, we will turn to another form of architecture, one that took the principle of thermal mass even further by building homes directly into the earth itself. Not all homes in northern China relied on the Kang alone for warmth. In the less plateau, where the soil was deep and soft enough to carve, families built their homes by excavation rather than construction. These were the Yaodong, the cave dwellings. The Yaodong is one of the oldest forms of human shelter in China. Archaeological evidence suggests that people were living in excavated caves as far back as the Neolithic period, thousands of years before the first dynasties. The practice continued unbroken into the modern era. The basic principle of the Yaodong is simple. Instead of building walls and a roof to enclose space, you dig into a hillside or cliff and create a room within the earth itself. The earth becomes the walls, the ceiling, the insulation. This approach was possible only in certain landscapes. The low-west soil of the plateau had unique properties. It was compacted over millennia by the weight of overlying layers, giving it structural stability. It was fine-grained, cohesive, able to hold a vertical wall without collapsing. At the same time, loess was soft enough to be worked with simple tools. A family could excavate a room using shovels and picks, without the need for explosives or heavy machinery. The work was labour-intensive but not technically complex. The result was a home that required no timber, no brick, no manufactured materials. Everything needed was already present in the landscape. The only cost was labour, and labour was something families had in abundance. The Yaodong was also thermally efficient in a way that surface-built homes could never match. Because the rooms were surrounded by earth on all sides except the front entrance, they were insulated by meters of soil. This soil acted as a thermal buffer, protecting the interior from the temperature extremes of the exterior. In winter, when the surface temperature might drop to minus 20 degrees Celsius, the interior of the Yaodong remained above 10 degrees. In summer, when the surface exceeded 35 degrees, the interior stayed cool, around 20 degrees. This stability was not the result of heating or cooling. It was the natural property of the earth itself. The temperature deep underground changes very slowly, lagging months behind the surface. In winter, the earth is releasing the warmth it absorbed during summer. In summer, it is releasing the coolness it retained from winter. This phenomenon is called thermal lag. It is the same principle that keeps deep caves at a constant temperature year-round, regardless of the weather above. For the inhabitants of a Yaodong, this meant that their home provided a baseline level of comfort without any active intervention. They did not need to heat the space as aggressively as those living in surface homes. The earth did much of the work for them. A Yaodong was not completely comfortable on its own. Even with the earth's insulation, the interior could still be chilly during the coldest months. Most Yaodong dwellings included a Kang for additional warmth. But the Kang did not need to work as hard. It supplemented the natural warmth of the earth rather than fighting against the cold from all sides. The construction of a Yaodong was a careful process. The site had to be chosen with attention to the angle of the hillside, the depth of the loess layer, the orientation to the sun. A south-facing Yaodong received more light and warmth during the short winter days. A north-facing Yaodong remained cooler in summer but was darker and damper in winter. The excavation began with the entrance. This was typically an arched opening, wide and tall enough for a person to walk through comfortably. The arch was not just aesthetic, it was structural. An arched opening distributed the weight of the overlying earth more evenly than a rectangular opening, reducing the risk of collapse. From the entrance, the excavation extended back into the hillside. The depth varied, but a typical Yaodong room was about 4 to 6 meters deep. The width was similar, creating a roughly square or rectangular space. The ceiling was also arched, following the same structural logic as the entrance. A flat ceiling would have required additional support to hold the weight of the earth above. An arched ceiling was self-supporting, the compression forces holding it in place. The floor was levelled and compacted. In some Yaodong, the floor was simply the natural loess, smoothed and hardened by foot traffic. In others, it was covered with brick or stone to provide a firmer surface and prevent dust. The walls were smoothed by hand or with simple tools. Some families applied a layer of plaster to seal the surface, preventing erosion and making the interior easier to clean. Others left the walls bare, accepting the natural texture of the loess. Ventilation was critical. Because the Yaodong was essentially a sealed chamber, there was a risk of poor air quality. The entrance provided the primary source of fresh air, but additional ventilation was often needed, especially when fires were burning inside. Some Yaodong had small vents cut through the ceiling to the surface above. These vents allowed stale air to escape and fresh air to enter, creating a gentle circulation. The vents had to be carefully positioned to avoid compromising the structural integrity of the ceiling. The Yaodong was not a single room, but often a complex of rooms, all excavated from the same hillside. A family might have 3 or 4 connected chambers, each serving a different function: sleeping, storage, cooking, living. These chambers were arranged side by side with their arched entrances facing a common courtyard. The courtyard was also excavated, creating a sunken open space in front of the rooms. This courtyard provided light and access while remaining protected from the wind. The Yaodong, like the Kang, was a technology born from necessity and refined through generations. It was a response to the specific conditions of the Loess Plateau, where timber was scarce. Stone was hard to quarry, and the earth itself was the most abundant and workable material. In the next chapter, we will explore the properties of Loess in greater detail, understanding why this particular soil made such dwellings possible. Loess is not ordinary dirt. It is a specific type of sediment, composed of silt-sized particles that were carried by wind over vast distances and deposited in thick layers. The Loess Plateau of China is one of the largest accumulations of this material in the world, with deposits reaching depths of 100 metres or more in some areas. The formation of Loess began during the Ice Ages, when glaciers ground rock into fine powder. Winds picked up this powder from dry riverbeds and desert margins, carrying it eastward across the continent. When the winds weakened, the particles settled layer upon layer over thousands of years. The result is a soil that is uniform in texture, composed almost entirely of particles between 2 and 60 micrometers in diameter. This uniformity gives Loess its distinctive properties. First, Loess is cohesive. The fine particles pack together tightly, and the presence of clay minerals and calcium carbonate acts as a natural binder. When dry, Loess can stand in vertical walls without slumping or collapsing. This is why cliffs of Loess often have sheer faces, unlike the sloped profiles of most soils. Second, Loess is porous. Despite its cohesion, it contains numerous small air pockets between the particles. This porosity allows Loess to absorb water, but also to dry out relatively quickly. It prevents the soil from becoming waterlogged, which would undermine its structural stability. Third, Loess is easy to work with hand tools. It is soft enough to dig, but firm enough to hold its shape. This made it ideal for excavation, allowing families to create living spaces without the need for advanced construction techniques. But the most important property of Loess, for our purposes, is its thermal behaviour. Loess has high thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. This is partly due to its mineral composition and partly due to its density. The tightly packed particles store energy in their molecular structure, and the lack of large voids means that the material acts as a continuous medium for heat conduction. When the sun warms the surface of the Loess Plateau during summer, that warmth penetrates gradually into the earth. The rate of penetration depends on the thermal diffusivity of the soil, a measure of how quickly heat moves through a material. For Loess, this rate is relatively slow. It takes weeks for the warmth to reach a depth of 1 metre, and months to reach 2 or 3 metres. By the time the warmth has penetrated to the depth of a Yaodong chamber, summer is ending and autumn is beginning. As winter arrives and the surface cools, the process reverses. The warmth stored deep in the earth begins to flow back toward the surface. But again, this flow is slow. The interior of the Yaodong remains warm even as the exterior freezes. This creates a situation where the temperature inside the Yaodong is always lagging behind the external conditions. In winter, the interior reflects the warmth of the previous summer. In summer, it reflects the coolness of the previous winter. The degree of lag depends on depth. A chamber excavated 2 meters into the earth experiences a smaller lag than one excavated 5 meters, but even at shallow depths the effect is noticeable. Measurements taken in traditional Yaodong dwellings show interior winter temperatures around 10 to 12 degrees Celsius, when the exterior is -20. Summer interior temperatures remain around 18 to 22 degrees when the exterior exceeds 35. These temperatures are not comfortable by modern standards. 10 degrees is cold, too cold to sit still for long without additional heating. But it is far warmer than -20. It is survivable. With the addition of a Kang and warm clothing, it becomes tolerable, even pleasant. The thermal lag also means that the interior temperature is stable. It does not fluctuate wildly with day-to-night cycles or with passing weather fronts. The Earth filters out these short-term variations, responding only to the slow seasonal rhythm. This stability was psychologically reassuring. People living in a Yaodong knew that no matter how cold the night became, the interior would not freeze. The Earth provided a baseline of protection, a floor below which the temperature would not fall. The humidity inside a Yaodong was also relatively stable, though it varied with the season. In winter, when the exterior air was dry and cold, the interior could become damp as moisture from cooking and breathing condensed on the cool walls. In summer, the situation reversed, with the interior being drier than the outside. Managing this humidity was part of the routine of Yaodong life. Ventilation was important, especially in winter when fires were burning and moisture was being added to the air. The arched entrance and any ceiling vents provided passive air exchange, preventing the build-up of stale, damp air. The loess itself absorbed some moisture, acting as a buffer. But if the walls became too wet, they could begin to erode, especially near the entrance where rain might blow in. Families addressed this by applying plaster or by constructing a small protective overhang above the entrance. The structural stability of Lewis was generally reliable, but not absolute. In areas with heavy rainfall or where the water table was high, Lewis could lose its cohesion and become prone to collapse. This limited the use of Yaodong to regions where the climate was dry and the drainage was good. Earthquakes were another concern. The Loess Plateau is seismically active, and tremors could cause cracks or collapses in Yaodong structures. However, the arched design provided some resilience, and many Yaodong survived quakes that destroyed surface-built homes. The knowledge of how to select a safe site, how to excavate without undermining the ceiling, how to maintain the structure over years, all of this was passed down through experience. People learned by observing the Yaodong that lasted and the ones that failed. The Loess, in this sense, was both a resource and a teacher. It offered the possibility of shelter, but it required understanding and respect. Those who worked with it carefully, who attended to its properties and limitations, could create homes that lasted for generations. In the next chapter, we will examine the different forms that Yaodong architecture took. The variations adapted to different terrains and needs. The Yaodong was not a single design, but a family of related forms, each adapted to specific topographic conditions. The most common type was the cliffside Yaodong, known in Chinese as the Kao Ya Yao, which translates roughly as leaning against the cliff cave. This was the form we have already described, excavated horizontally into the face of a hill or cliff. Cliffside Yaodong were built wherever there was a suitable slope. The Loess Plateau is heavily eroded, cut by countless ravines and gullies, and many of these provided ideal sites. A family would choose a south-facing slope to maximize sunlight and warmth. They would excavate one or more chambers, arranging them side by side with a common courtyard in front. The courtyard was important. It provided access to the rooms, a place to work outdoors during fair weather, and a buffer zone that collected light and reflected it into the cave interiors. The courtyard was often paved with brick or stone to prevent it from becoming muddy during rain. In flatter areas, where there were no cliffs or steep slopes, a different approach was needed. This led to the development of the sunken Yaodong, or Dekengyuan, meaning pit courtyard. The sunken Yaodong began with the excavation of a large rectangular or square pit, often 10 to 15 metres on a side and 5 to 7 metres deep. This pit was dug straight down into the earth, creating a sunken courtyard open to the sky. Once the pit was completed, rooms were excavated into the 4 vertical walls of the pit, just as they would be excavated into a hillside. Each wall might contain 1 to 3 chambers, depending on the size of the household. The result was a compact dwelling with all the rooms facing inward toward the central courtyard. Access to the pit was provided by a sloped or stepped ramp, usually located in one corner. This ramp descended from the surface level down to the floor of the courtyard. Some pits had a tunnel entrance instead, a horizontal passage that emerged at the bottom of the pit. The sunken Yaodong had several advantages. It required no hillside, making it feasible in flat terrain. It was also more protected from wind. The walls of the pit blocked the harsh northern winds that swept across the plateau in winter, creating a sheltered microclimate in the courtyard. The disadvantage was drainage. Because the courtyard was below ground level, water from rain or snowmelt could accumulate. To prevent flooding, a drainage channel or well was usually dug in the lowest corner of the pit, allowing water to seep into the deeper soil layers. The third form of Yaodong was the hoop, or surface-built Yaodong, called the guyao. This was not excavated but constructed on flat ground, using a thick shell of brick or stone to create an arched structure that mimicked the thermal properties of a true cave. The guyao was used in areas where the lowest layer was too thin for safe excavation, or where the water table was too high. It required more materials and labour than an excavated Yaodong, but it offered similar thermal benefits. The construction of a guyao began with a foundation, often a platform raised slightly above ground level to protect against moisture. Walls were built in an arched profile, thick and heavily insulated. The arch was then covered with a layer of earth, sometimes a metre or more deep to provide thermal mass. From the outside, a guyao resembled a low mound or berm, with only the arched entrance visible. From the inside, it felt much like an excavated Yaodong, with the same dim light, the same stable temperature, the same sense of enclosure. All three forms of Yaodong shared the fundamental principle of using earth as insulation and thermal mass. Whether the earth surrounded the room because it had been carved away, or because it had been piled on top, the effect was similar, a dwelling that maintained a stable interior climate with minimal energy input. The choice of which form to build depended on the site. A family with access to a good hillside would build a cliffside Yaodong. A family on flat land with deep loess would dig a pit courtyard. A family in a marginal area might construct a guyao. In some villages, all three forms could be found side by side, each household adapting to the specific conditions of their plot. This diversity reflected the flexibility of the Yaodong concept. It was not a rigid template, but a set of principles that could be applied in different ways. The interior layout of Yaodong, regardless of type, followed similar patterns. The main room, where the family gathered and slept, was usually the largest and positioned in the centre. Smaller side rooms served as storage, cooking areas, or additional sleeping spaces for extended family members. The arched ceiling created a sense of spaciousness despite the relatively small floor area. The curve drew the eye upward, and the diffused light from the entrance softened the boundaries of the room. Furnishings were minimal. The Kang occupied much of the main room, serving as bed, seating and table. Storage chests lined the walls. A small altar might be placed in a niche, honouring ancestors or local deities. There was little space for anything beyond the essentials. This simplicity was partly a matter of necessity. The Yaodong had limited volume, and every item had to justify its presence. But it was also a reflection of the lifestyle. Possessions were few, and value was placed on function rather than decoration. The Yaodong shaped the rhythm of daily life. The dimness of the interior meant that much work was done outside when weather permitted. The courtyard became an extension of the living space, used for cooking, washing and socialising during the warmer months. In winter, life contracted inward. The family spent more time inside, gathered on the Kang, engaging in activities that required little light or space, repairing tools, mending clothes, telling stories. The Yaodong also fostered a particular relationship with the landscape. People who lived in excavated homes were literally embedded in the earth. Their dwelling was not imposed on the land but carved from it. This created a sense of continuity, of being part of the geology rather than separate from it. In the next chapter, we will consider the sensory experience of living in such a space, the qualities of light and sound and silence that defined the Yaodong interior. To live in a Yaodong was to inhabit a world of profound quiet. The thick walls of earth absorbed sound in a way that no surface-built structure could match. Voices did not echo. Footsteps did not reverberate. The usual acoustic clutter of daily life, the creak of wood, the rattle of wind against walls, the distant sounds of animals or neighbours, all of this was muffled or absent entirely. The silence was not absolute. Inside the Yaodong you could hear the immediate sounds of the household, The scrape of a pot on the Kang, the rustle of clothing, the breathing of family members. But these sounds remained contained, intimate. They did not carry beyond the room. From outside, the sounds of the world reached the interior only faintly. A heavy rain might be audible as a soft pattering on the earth above. Thunder would arrive as a distant rumble filtered through meters of soil. Wind, which could howl across the open plateau, was reduced to a gentle sigh at the entrance. This acoustic isolation created an environment conducive to rest. There were no sudden noises to startle someone awake, no abrupt interruptions. Sleep in a Yaodong was undisturbed by the external world, wrapped in the earth's natural dampening. The quality of light was equally distinctive. Because the Yaodong had only one opening, the arched entrance facing the courtyard, natural light entered from a single direction. This light was diffused by the time it reached the back of the chamber, softened by distance and the slight haze of dust particles in the air. During the day, the front portion of the room near the entrance was relatively bright, especially if the entrance faced south and caught direct sunlight. The middle section held a gentler illumination, enough to see clearly but not harsh. The back of the room remained in shadow, dim but not entirely dark. This gradient of light created different zones within a single space. Activities requiring good visibility, sewing, reading, detailed handwork, were performed near the entrance. Tasks that required less precision could be done further back. Sleep happened in the dimmest areas, where the darkness was deepest. At night, the Yaodong became truly dark. There were no streetlights, no ambient glow from neighbouring windows. If no lamp or candle was lit, the interior was as black as a sealed cave. This darkness was total, disorienting if you were not accustomed to it. Families used oil lamps for light after sunset, small vessels burning vegetable oil or animal fat with a cloth wick. These lamps provided a flickering golden illumination that pushed back the darkness in a small radius. Beyond that radius, shadows deepened quickly. The placement of the lamp mattered. On the Kang, it could light the area where people were sitting or working. Hung from a hook on the wall, it could illuminate a broader section of the room. But fuel was precious, and lamps were not kept burning longer than necessary. Most evenings, once the work was done and the meal finished, the lamp would be extinguished, and the family would settle into sleep. The darkness and silence of the Yaodong encouraged an early sleep schedule. Without artificial light, there was little reason to stay awake once the sun had set. The body's natural rhythms aligned with the day-night cycle, and sleep came easily in the quiet dark. The temperature inside the Yaodong also contributed to this sense of enclosure and rest. The stable warmth, even in winter, created a microclimate that felt separate from the harsh conditions outside. The interior was a refuge, a pocket of relative comfort carved out of an unforgiving landscape. There was also a psychological dimension to living underground. People who spent their lives in Yaodong often described a feeling of being protected, held by the earth. The weight of the soil above was not oppressive but reassuring, a constant presence that did not threaten but sheltered. This sense of connection to the land was heightened by the knowledge that the Yaodong was made from the land itself. The walls were not imported materials but the same loess that covered the plateau. To touch the wall was to touch the earth, to be in direct contact with the geology of the region. Some inhabitants spoke of the Yaodong as breathing, a living space that expanded and contracted with changes in humidity and temperature. The walls would absorb moisture during damp periods and release it during dry ones, creating a subtle exchange between the interior and the surrounding soil. This perception, whether literally accurate or not, reflected a deeper understanding of the Yaodong as part of a larger system. It was not a sealed box, but a permeable membrane, connected to the water cycle, the temperature cycle, the seasonal rhythms of the plateau. The sensory quietness of the Yaodong also shaped the way people interacted with each other. Conversations were softer, more measured. There was no need to raise your voice to be heard above the noise of wind or traffic. Words carried clearly in the stillness, and silence was comfortable, not awkward. This quietness extended to the rhythm of activities. Work inside the Yaodong was often slow and deliberate. There was no rush, no urgency imposed by external stimuli. Time seemed to move differently, stretched out and unhurried. For sleep, this environment was ideal. The body could relax fully, knowing that the space was secure, that the temperature would not fluctuate dramatically, that no sudden sound would intrude. The Yaodong provided not just physical shelter, but a mental stillness that allowed deep rest. In modern terms, we might describe the Yaodong as a sensory deprivation chamber, but that phrase carries connotations of sterility and isolation. The Yaodong was neither sterile nor isolating. It was warm, lived in, infused with the presence of family and the accumulated traces of daily life. The smells of cooking lingered in the air. The surfaces bore the marks of use, the wear patterns of hands and feet and bodies. The space was personalised, adapted to the specific needs and habits of its occupants. Yet within this personalisation, there remained a fundamental simplicity. The Yaodong offered few distractions. Its architecture did not demand attention. It receded into the background, providing shelter without imposing itself. This quality of being present but unobtrusive, of supporting life without dominating it, was perhaps the Yaodong's greatest virtue. It allowed people to focus on the essential activities of survival: eating, working, resting. It did not require constant maintenance or adjustment. It simply was stable and reliable, year after year. In the next chapter, we will shift our focus from architecture to textiles, examining how people extended their protection against the cold through the clothing and bedding they created. The warmth of the Kang and the shelter of the Yaodong were necessary but not sufficient. The human body itself needed additional insulation, layers that could be worn during the day and piled on during the night. Without proper clothing and bedding, even the best heated home would not prevent the cold from reaching the skin. For most of Chinese history, the materials available for making these layers were limited. The climate of northern China was not conducive to raising sheep in large numbers, so wool was scarce. Silk, though produced in the south, was expensive and reserved for the wealthy. The common people relied on plant fibres. The earliest winter garments were made from hemp and ramie, coarse fabrics woven from the stalks of plants. These materials were durable but not particularly warm. To create insulation, people had to add bulk through stuffing. The stuffing materials varied by region and availability. In some areas, dried reeds were gathered from marshes and fluffed to create a layer of trapped air. In others, oakum, loose fibres from old rope, was repurposed as padding. Straw from grain harvests could also be used, though it was scratchy and tended to break down quickly. These stuffed garments were effective to a degree. They created a barrier between the body and the outside air, slowing the loss of heat. But they were heavy, stiff, and difficult to clean. The stuffing would compact over time, losing its insulating properties, and had to be replaced each season. For the very poor, even stuffed hemp was beyond reach. These families relied on layering multiple thin garments, creating insulation, through the air trapped between each layer. This was less effective than proper padding, but it was better than nothing. The truly destitute sometimes resorted to wearing their summer clothes throughout the winter, supplementing them with whatever scraps of fabric they could find. Survival in such circumstances was precarious, and many did not make it through the coldest months. The situation changed dramatically during the Ming Dynasty, beginning in the 14th century. This was when cotton cultivation became widespread in China, and with it came a revolution in winter clothing. Cotton had been known in China for centuries, grown in small quantities in the south, but it was not until the Yuan and early Ming periods that the techniques for processing and weaving cotton were refined and disseminated across the country. A key figure in this dissemination was Huang Daopo, a woman from the region around Shanghai, who had learned advanced cotton spinning techniques and shared them widely. Her methods increased the efficiency of cotton production and made cotton textiles affordable for ordinary families. Cotton offered several advantages over hemp. It was softer against the skin, more comfortable to wear for long periods. It was lighter in weight for the same level of insulation, and most importantly, it was far better at trapping air. Cotton fibres have a natural crimp, a slight twist and curl. When many fibres are packed together, they create a matrix of tiny air pockets. Air is an excellent insulator, and the more air you can trap in a stable form, the warmer the fabric becomes. This property made cotton ideal for padded winter garments. The padding, called mian in Chinese, could be made from raw cotton that had been cleaned and fluffed but not spun into thread. This cotton batting was layered between two sheets of woven fabric, creating a quilt-like structure. The resulting garment was called a mian ao, a padded coat. It became the standard winter wear for people across northern China, replacing the older stuffed hemp garments almost entirely within a few generations. The mian ao was constructed with care. The outer layer was usually made from sturdy cotton or hemp fabric, dyed in dark colours that would not show dirt easily. The inner layer was softer, often undyed cotton, placed against the skin for comfort. Between these two layers, the cotton batting was arranged evenly, spreading it out so there were no thin spots or gaps. The layers were then stitched together in a pattern of parallel or diamond-shaped quilting. This stitching served two purposes. It held the layers together so they would not shift, and it prevented the cotton batting from clumping in one area. The design of the coat itself was simple but effective. It featured wide sleeves that could be tucked into hand warmers or folded back for work. The front closure overlapped from right to left, a style called yuren, which minimized gaps where cold air could enter. Cloth. Ties or buttons held the coat closed, and a fabric belt cinched it at the waist. For sleeping, a similar construction was used to make the mian bei, the padded quilt. This was essentially a large rectangle of quilted cotton batting, big enough to cover one or more people lying on the Kang. Some families had multiple quilts, layering them for additional warmth on the coldest nights. The creation of these garments was labour-intensive. It required growing or purchasing the cotton, cleaning it to remove seeds and debris, fluffing it to restore its loft, cutting and sewing the fabric layers, and performing the detailed quilting that held everything together. This work was almost always done by women as part of the household's seasonal routine. It was skilled labour, requiring an eye for even distribution, and a steady hand for the long seams. A well-made mian ao or mian bei could last for years if properly maintained. Maintenance was crucial. Over the course of a winter, the cotton batting would gradually compress from the weight of the body and the moisture of sweat. By spring, the garments would have lost much of their insulating power. To restore them, the outer and inner layers of fabric were carefully separated, and the old cotton was removed. This cotton was then spread out in the sun to dry thoroughly. Once dry, it was beaten with a wooden tool, a process that broke apart the compressed fibres and reintroduced air into the matrix. The beaten cotton was then replaced between the fabric layers, which had been washed and mended as needed. The whole garment was reassembled and requilted, ready for the next winter. This annual cycle of disassembly, cleaning and reassembly was not seen as a burden, but as a necessary part of maintaining the household. It was a time for inspection, for catching small tears before they became large ones, for ensuring that everything was in good order. The mian ao and mian bei represented a significant improvement in the quality of winter life. With proper cotton padding, people could sleep more comfortably, work outdoors for longer periods, and generally endure the cold with less suffering. But cotton was not the only material innovation. In times of scarcity, when even cotton was difficult to obtain, people turned to other solutions. One of the most surprising was paper. Spring arrived gradually on the northern plains. The frozen earth began to thaw. The bitter winds softened. Daylight extended its reach, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, bringing warmth that penetrated deeper with each passing week. For families who had endured the winter, spring was a time of renewal, not just for the land, but for the household itself. The transition from winter to warmer weather required a series of tasks, rituals of preparation that marked the changing season. One of the most important of these rituals involved the winter bedding and clothing. The mian ao and mian bei, which had been worn and slept under for months, were now heavy with the accumulated moisture of the winter. Sweat, breath, and the dampness of the indoor air had all settled into the cotton batting, compressing it and reducing its effectiveness as insulation. As soon as the weather was reliably dry and warm, usually in late spring, the women of the household would begin the process of renovation. The work started with the removal of the cotton padding from the fabric shells. The quilted stitching that held the layers together was carefully unpicked, thread by thread. This was meticulous work, requiring patience to avoid tearing the fabric. The threads were saved and would be reused for other mending tasks. Once the stitching was removed, the fabric layers were separated and the cotton batting was pulled out. This cotton was no longer fluffy and light. It had become matted, flattened into dense sheets by the pressure of bodies lying on it night after night. The fabric shells were washed, water was heated in large pots over the cooking fire, and the cloth was scrubbed with lye soap made from wood ash and animal fat. Stains from food, sweat and dirt were worked out as much as possible. The fabric was then rinsed in clean water and hung to dry in the sun. While the fabric dried, attention turned to the cotton itself. The compressed batting was spread out on clean mats in the courtyard, exposed to direct sunlight. The sun's heat drove out the moisture that had accumulated during the winter, preventing mildew and restoring the fibres to a workable state. After several hours of drying, the cotton was ready for the most critical step, beating. The tool used for this was simple, a wooden bow with a taut string. The bow was large, sometimes as tall as a person, with the string stretched across a curved frame. This was not a musical instrument but a textile tool, designed specifically for fluffing cotton. The process was called tanmian, cotton beating, and it required both strength and rhythm. The woman performing the task would lay the dried cotton on a flat surface. She would then strike the cotton with the bowstring, causing it to vibrate. This vibration shook the compressed fibres apart, reintroducing air into the matrix and restoring the cotton's loft. The motion was repetitive, almost meditative. Strike, lift, strike again. The sound of the bowstring resonated through the courtyard, a distinctive thwacking that signalled to the entire village that spring cleaning was underway. As the cotton was beaten, it visibly expanded, doubling or even tripling in volume as the fibres separated and air filled the spaces between them. What had been a thin, dense mat became a thick, airy cloud of white fibres. This transformation was essential. Without it, the cotton would remain compressed and would provide little insulation during the next winter. The beating restored the material's fundamental property, its ability to trap air and slow the transfer of heat. Once the cotton was fully fluffed, it was carefully gathered and set aside, protected from dirt and moisture. The washed and dried fabric shells were brought out, inspected for any damage, and mended where necessary. The reassembly could then begin. The cotton was laid between the 2 layers of fabric spread evenly across the entire surface. The woman doing the work used her hands to smooth and distribute the batting, ensuring that there were no lumps or thin spots. When the distribution was satisfactory, the quilting began. Using a long needle and strong thread, she stitched through all 3 layers: outer fabric, cotton batting, inner fabric, following a pattern that would hold everything in place. The stitches formed rows or grids, each seam securing a section of the batting and preventing it from shifting during use. This quilting was time-consuming. A single mian bay might take several hours to complete, and a household might have multiple quilts and several padded coats to reassemble. But the work was not rushed. It was done carefully, with attention to detail, because the quality of the stitching directly affected the garment's performance. When the quilting was finished, the edges were bound with strips of fabric to prevent fraying. Ties or buttons were reattached to coats. The completed items were then folded and stored in chests or hung from pegs, ready for the next winter. This annual cycle of disassembly, cleaning, beating and reassembly was not unique to any single household. It was a pattern repeated across the entire region, a shared rhythm that connected individual families to the larger community. The timing of the work was often coordinated, not through any formal agreement, but through observation and habit. When one family began beating cotton in their courtyard, others would follow within days. The sound of the bowstring became a seasonal marker, as reliable as the return of migrating birds or the blooming of certain flowers. There was also a social dimension to the work. While the actual labour was performed by individual women, the preparation and the aftermath often involved neighbours. Cotton beating was physically demanding, and younger women might help older relatives. Conversations happened across courtyard walls, advice was shared, techniques were compared. The Ritual of Renewal served multiple purposes. Practically, it maintained the essential tools of winter survival, ensuring that they would function properly when needed again. Economically, it extended the life of valuable materials, reducing the need to purchase new cotton or fabric. But it also served a psychological function. The act of taking apart the winter bedding and putting it back together marked a clear transition. Winter was truly over. The household was not merely enduring the warm months but actively preparing for the next cold season, exercising control over their environment through foresight and effort. This forward-looking aspect of the ritual was important. It acknowledged that winter would return, that the cycle was ongoing, but it also affirmed that the family had the knowledge and resources to meet it. The Mianao and Mianbei, renewed and restored, were tangible proof of resilience. In the next chapter, we will explore another, less expected solution to the problem of winter clothing, one that emerged during periods when even cotton was scarce. There were times in Chinese history when the usual materials for clothing became difficult to obtain. Prolonged warfare disrupted trade routes and agricultural production. Famines reduced the land available for growing cotton or hemp. Natural disasters destroyed stored textiles. In such periods, people were forced to improvise to find alternatives to the standard fabrics. One of the most ingenious alternatives was paper. The use of paper for clothing might seem absurd to a modern observer. Paper, as we know it, is thin, fragile, easily torn. It dissolves in water. It offers no obvious advantages as a textile, but the paper used for clothing in traditional China was not the same as the paper we use for writing. It was made from different materials and processed in different ways, resulting in a product that was thick, durable, and surprisingly warm. The primary source of this paper was the bark of the paper mulberry tree, a species common in central and southern China. The inner bark of this tree contains long, strong fibres that can be separated and processed into a pulp. When this pulp is formed into sheets and dried, it creates a material that is both flexible and sturdy. The process of making paper clothing began with the harvesting of the bark. This was done in late winter or early spring, when the sap was rising and the bark could be more easily stripped from the wood. The outer bark was removed and discarded, and the inner bark was soaked in water to soften it. After soaking, the bark was beaten repeatedly to break down the cellular structure and release the fibres. This beating was similar in principle to the beating of cotton, though more vigorous. The goal was to create a fibrous pulp that could be spread into thin layers. The pulp was then mixed with water and poured onto a flat screen, where it was spread evenly and allowed to drain. As the water drained away, the fibres bonded together, forming a sheet. This sheet was pressed to remove excess moisture and then dried in the sun or over gentle heat. The resulting paper was much thicker than writing paper, often several millimetres in depth. It had a rough fibrous texture and a natural tan or grey colour. It was pliable, able to be folded and shaped without cracking. To make clothing, multiple sheets of this paper were layered together, often with an adhesive between the layers to increase strength. The layered paper was then cut and sewn just like fabric, using strong thread and reinforced seams. The garments produced were called jiao, paper coats. They were worn primarily during the Wei and Jin dynasties, a period of political fragmentation and frequent conflict that lasted from the 3rd to the 6th centuries. During this time, fabric shortages were common, and paper clothing became a practical necessity. But the use of paper coats did not end with the Wei-Jin period. They continued to be worn sporadically through the Tang, Song, and even into the Ming and Qing dynasties, particularly by monks, scholars, and the rural poor. Monks found paper coats useful because they were inexpensive and aligned with the Buddhist emphasis on simplicity and non-attachment to material goods. The coats required no animal products, making them suitable for those who adhered strictly to vegetarian principles. Scholars appreciated paper coats for different reasons. They were lightweight and did not restrict movement, making them comfortable for long hours of reading and writing. The poet Lu Yu, who lived during the Southern Song dynasty, wrote fondly of his paper jacket, noting that it kept him warm, without the bulk of padded cotton. For the poor, paper coats were simply the best option available when cotton or hemp were beyond their means. The materials were cheap or even free if you could harvest the bark yourself. The labour required was significant, but labour was something most families had in abundance. The insulating properties of paper clothing came from the same principle as other textiles: trapped air. The layered sheets of paper created numerous small pockets where air could be held still. Still air is a poor conductor of heat, so the body's warmth was retained rather than radiating away into the cold environment. Paper coats were not waterproof, but they were somewhat water-resistant, especially if treated with oils or waxes. A light rain would bead on the surface rather than soaking in immediately. However, prolonged exposure to moisture would cause the paper to soften and eventually disintegrate. For this reason, paper coats were primarily worn indoors or during dry weather. They were not suitable for heavy outdoor work in wet conditions. But for sleeping, for sitting on the Kang during long winter evenings, they were adequate. The durability of paper clothing varied. A well-made coat could last a full season, or even longer if handled carefully. But the constant flexing of wear would eventually cause the paper to fatigue and tear. Repairs were possible, patching holes with additional layers of paper, but there was a limit to how much a garment could be mended before it had to be discarded. When a paper coat reached the end of its useful life, it was sometimes burned for warmth, adding a final contribution to the household's energy budget. The ashes, rich in minerals from the plant fibres, could be spread on the garden or added to compost. The existence of paper clothing speaks to the resourcefulness of people living under constraint. When the usual materials were unavailable, they did not simply give up or freeze. They looked to the materials at hand, trees, water, labour, and found a way to make them serve. This adaptability was a survival trait, honed over generations of dealing with unpredictability. Harvests failed. Wars disrupted trade. Disasters struck without warning. The families that survived were those that could improvise, that held multiple strategies for meeting the same basic need. Paper coats were one strategy among many. They were not the preferred solution. Cotton was better when you could get it. But they were a viable fallback, a testament to the ingenuity that necessity can produce. In the next chapter, we will turn to smaller, more portable sources of warmth, devices that allowed people to carry heat with them as they moved through the cold spaces of the home. The Kang provided warmth for the whole family, but it was fixed in place. If you needed to move to another room, to work in the kitchen or visit a neighbour, you left the warmth behind. The air in these other spaces was cold and the body cooled, quickly, without the radiant heat of the platform. To address this, a variety of portable heating devices were developed. These were small enough to carry, safe enough to use indoors, and effective enough to make a noticeable difference in comfort. The most common of these was the Tangpozi. The Tangpozi was a container designed to hold hot water and release its heat slowly over several hours. It was typically made from metal, copper, tin, or iron, shaped into a rounded or flattened form. The most common shape resembled a pumpkin, with a bulbous body and a narrow neck at the top. The neck was fitted with a screw cap or a cork stopper, sealed tightly to prevent water from leaking out. Some Tangpozi had an additional layer of wax or cloth wrapped around the threads of the cap to ensure a watertight seal. The size varied, but a typical Tangpozi held about 1 to 2 litres of water. It was large enough to store significant heat, but small enough to be handled easily and tucked into, bedding without taking up excessive space. The process of using a Tangpozi was simple. In the evening, before bed, water was boiled in a pot on the cooking stove. When the water reached a full boil, it was carefully poured into the Tangpozi through the open neck. The container was filled nearly to the top, leaving only a small airspace to allow for expansion as the metal heated. The cap was then screwed on tightly. The Tangpozi was wiped dry on the outside to remove any spilled water, and then it was wrapped in a cloth bag. This bag served 2 purposes. It protected the user from direct contact with the hot metal, and it provided an additional layer of insulation to slow the cooling. The wrapped Tangpozi was then placed in the bed, usually near the feet. The feet lose heat rapidly, and are often the first part of the body to feel cold. Warming the feet helped maintain overall comfort and made it easier to fall asleep. As the night progressed, the water inside the Tangpozi gradually cooled, transferring its heat through the metal walls and into the surrounding bedding. This heat was then absorbed by the body of the person sleeping nearby. The rate of cooling depended on the ambient temperature and the quality of the insulation. On a very cold night, the Tangpozi might cool to body temperature within 3 or 4 hours. On a milder night, it could remain noticeably warm until morning. Even after the water had cooled, the Tangpozi retained some residual heat, and its presence in the bed still provided a psychological comfort. It was a focal point of warmth, a small anchor against the cold. The Tangpozi was nicknamed the Tangpo, which translates roughly as hot wife or warming companion. This affectionate term reflected its role as a bedtime comfort, a substitute for the warmth of another human body. In some regions, it was also called the Tangmu or foot mother, emphasizing its function of warming the feet. The use of the Tangpozi was widespread across northern China, and similar devices appeared in other cultures facing cold winters. In Japan, the yutanpo served the same function. In Europe, bed warmers filled with hot coals or bricks were common before the advent of modern heating. What distinguished the Tangpozi from these other devices was its safety. Because it used water rather than open coals, there was no risk of fire or carbon monoxide poisoning. It could be used safely in enclosed spaces, under blankets, even in contact with the body. The metal construction also made it durable. A well-made Tangpozi could last for decades, passed down through generations. The only maintenance required was occasional inspection of the cap's seal and the replacement of the cloth bag when it wore out. For families who could not afford a metal Tangpozi, ceramic versions were available. These were made from fired clay, shaped and glazed to hold water. Ceramic Tangpozi were cheaper, but also more fragile, prone to cracking if dropped or subjected to rapid temperature changes. Some households used both metal and ceramic Tangpozi, the metal ones for daily use, and the ceramic ones as backups or for guests. The preparation of the Tangpozi became part of the evening routine. It was usually the task of the women or older children, performed while the evening meal was being cooked. The same fire that heated the food also heated the water for the Tangpozi, another example of the efficient use of fuel. In wealthy households, servants might be responsible for preparing multiple Tangpozi, one for each member of the family. In poorer households, a single Tangpozi might be shared, passed between family members or used on alternate nights. The Tangpozi was not limited to bedtime use. During the day, it could be filled with hot water and carried to provide warmth while sitting, working, or travelling. People going on winter journeys might take a Tangpozi wrapped in their luggage, refilling it with hot water at inns along the way. The device also had medicinal applications. In traditional Chinese medicine, warmth was considered therapeutic for certain ailments. A Tangpozi applied to the abdomen could ease digestive discomfort. Placed on the back, it could relieve muscle tension. Held in the hands, it could improve circulation. These uses were based on the principle that heat promotes the flow of qi, the vital energy believed to circulate through the body. While modern medicine does not recognize qi in the same terms, the therapeutic effects of localized warmth, increased blood flow, muscle relaxation, pain relief are well documented. The Tangpozi, then, was more than just a comfort item. It was a versatile tool, integrated into multiple aspects of daily life. It represented a simple but effective solution to the problem of staying warm in specific, localized ways when broader heating was not available. In the next chapter, we will examine another portable heater, one that used fire rather than water and required more skill to use safely. While the Tangpozi relied on hot water, another portable heater used fire directly. This was the Shoulu, the hand warmer. The Shoulu was a more complex device than the Tangpozi, both in construction and in use. It consisted of two nested metal shells, one inside the other, with a carefully designed system for holding burning charcoal while keeping the outer surface safe to touch. The inner shell was a small basin, typically made from thick copper. This basin held the fuel, small pieces of charcoal or charred wood. The charcoal was not allowed to burn with open flames, but was kept in a state of slow, smouldering combustion, producing steady heat without smoke. To achieve this smouldering state, the charcoal was first lit in a separate brazier until it was fully ignited and glowing red. Then it was transferred to the Shoulu and covered with a layer of fine ash. This ash layer restricted the flow of oxygen, slowing the combustion and preventing flames from developing. The outer shell enclosed the inner basin but was separated from it by a small air gap. This gap provided insulation, ensuring that the heat from the charcoal did not make the outer surface dangerously hot. A person could hold the Shoulu comfortably in their hands even while the interior was glowing with heat. The top of the Shoulu featured a perforated lid, often decorated with intricate patterns of flowers, geometric designs, or auspicious symbols. These perforations served a functional purpose. They allowed air to enter the device, providing just enough oxygen to keep the charcoal burning without allowing it to flare into open flame. The lid was usually hinged or removable, allowing access to the interior for adding fresh charcoal or clearing out ash. Some designs included a small handle or chain attached to the lid, making it easier to lift without burning the fingers. The outer shell was often elaborately decorated. Wealthy families owned shoulu made from brass or bronze engraved, with scenes from nature or literature, inlaid with enamel or precious stones. These were status symbols as much as functional objects, displayed as evidence of refinement and taste. For less wealthy families, simpler versions were made from iron or tin, with minimal decoration. But even these plain models followed the same basic design principles: double shell construction, perforated lid, careful control of airflow. The shoulu was small enough to be held in one hand, or tucked into the wide sleeves of traditional Chinese robes. During the Ming and Qing dynasties, robes featured sleeves that extended well beyond the fingertips when the arms were lowered. These sleeves created pockets where small items could be carried, and the shoulu fit perfectly into this space. Carrying a shoulu in the sleeve allowed a person to keep their hands warm while moving through cold spaces. Scholars used them while writing, preventing their fingers from becoming stiff and clumsy. Officials carried them during winter audiences at court, where the halls were often unheated despite the formality of the setting. The use of the shoulu required some skill and attention. If too much oxygen reached the charcoal, it would burn too quickly, producing excessive heat and depleting the fuel rapidly. If too little oxygen was available, the charcoal would extinguish and the device would cool. The layer of ash on top of the charcoal was critical. It had to be thick enough to restrict airflow, but not so thick that it smothered the fire entirely. Users learned to judge this by experience, adjusting the ash layer based on the size of the charcoal pieces and the ambient temperature. Fresh charcoal was added periodically throughout the day as the old pieces burned down to ash. This required opening the lid and carefully placing new pieces on top of the old, then recovering them with ash. The timing of these additions was important. Waiting too long meant the fire would go out, but adding too soon wasted fuel. Safety was a concern. Although the outer shell remained relatively cool, the interior was hot enough to ignite cloth if the device was handled carelessly. There were accounts of sleeves catching fire when a shoulu was carried improperly, or when the lid was accidentally left open. To prevent such accidents, users were taught to keep the shoulu upright and to avoid sudden movements that might cause the charcoal to shift and contact the outer shell directly. When not in use, the shoulu was placed on a heat-resistant surface, never directly on wood or fabric. Despite these risks, the shoulu remained popular for centuries. The warmth it provided was immediate and concentrated, perfect for warming cold hands or holding near the body during brief exposures to cold. The shoulu also had a social dimension. Giving someone a shoulu, especially an ornate one, was a gesture of care and regard. It implied that you were concerned for their comfort during the cold months, that you wished them warmth and well-being. During festivals and family gatherings, hosts would often provide shoulu for their guests, ensuring that everyone remained comfortable even in unheated reception rooms. This hospitality extended the principle of the Kang, offering warmth as a fundamental form of welcome to spaces where a Kang was not present. The maintenance of a shoulu was minimal. The metal shells needed occasional cleaning to remove accumulated ash and soot. The perforations in the lid could become clogged and needed to be cleared with a thin wire or needle. But otherwise, the device was durable and required no specialized care. Charcoal, the fuel for the shoulu, was more expensive than the agricultural waste used in the Kang. It was produced by charring wood in a low-oxygen environment, a process that required time and expertise. For this reason, the shoulu was associated more with urban households and the middle and upper classes who could afford to purchase charcoal regularly. In rural areas where wood and charcoal were scarce, the shoulu was less common. Families relied instead on the Tangpozi or on layers of clothing to keep warm. The shoulu was a luxury, appreciated when available but not essential for survival. Yet even in its status as a luxury item, the shoulu reflected the same underlying principle: that guided all thermal management in traditional China. The efficient use of limited resources to create localized warmth exactly where and when it was needed. The Shoulu did not attempt to heat an entire room. It warmed a pair of hands, a small area near the body. This targeted approach minimized fuel consumption while maximizing comfort for the individual. In the next chapter, we will step back from specific devices and examine the broader system of fuel management that made all of these heating strategies possible. The warmth of the Kang, the heat of the Tangpozi, the glow of the Shoulu, all of these depended on fuel. Without fuel, there was no fire. Without fire, there was no heat. The availability and management of fuel was therefore central to winter survival, as important as the architecture of the home or the quality of the clothing. In northern China, the primary fuel was not wood or coal, but agricultural waste. This was a necessity born from the landscape. The northern plains and the lowest plateau were not forested regions. Trees were scattered, not abundant, and those that existed were needed for construction, for tools, for fruit production. Cutting them for fuel was wasteful and short-sighted. Coal was available in some areas, mined from deposits near the surface. But coal required transportation, which added to its cost, and it produced a harsher, smokier burn than many families found desirable. It was used when available and affordable, but it was not the universal solution. Instead, families burned what remained after the harvest: corn stalks, wheat chaff, millet husks, sorghum stems, dried grasses, prunings from fruit trees. These materials were abundant in an agricultural society, and they were renewable, produced anew each growing season. The collection and storage of this fuel began immediately after the harvest. As the grain was brought in and threshed, the stalks and chaff were not discarded but gathered carefully. They were bundled and tied, stacked in dry locations, protected from rain and snow. Corn stalks were particularly valued. The thick stems burned slowly and produced steady heat. After the kernels were removed, the cobs were also saved. Dried cobs were excellent fuel, dense and long-burning, ideal for the extended heating sessions needed to warm the Kang thoroughly. Wheat and millet stalks were lighter and burned more quickly. They were useful for quick fires when only a brief period of heat was needed, such as for cooking a simple meal. But they were less effective for overnight heating, as they did not store as much energy per unit volume. Prunings from orchards, apple, pear, apricot, were hardwood and burned hotter than grain stalks. They were saved for the coldest nights when maximum heat was necessary. Some families also collected dried grasses from uncultivated areas, binding them into tight bundles that could be fed into the stove. The total quantity of fuel needed for a winter was substantial. A typical household might require several tons of dried plant material to make it through 4 or 5 months of cold weather. This material had to be stored somewhere dry and accessible. Storage took many forms. Some families built sheds or covered platforms specifically for fuel. Others stacked bundles on the roof of the house, where they were protected by an overhang but still exposed to air circulation that kept them dry. In the Yaodong, fuel was often stored in unused side chambers or in the sunken courtyard. The arrangement of the fuel was not random. The most commonly used types were kept closest to the kitchen, easily accessible for daily cooking. The less frequently used types, such as hardwood prunings, were stored further away. This organisation minimised effort and ensured that the right fuel was available when needed. Rationing was essential. The fuel collected in autumn had to last until spring, and there was no guarantee of resupply if it ran out prematurely. Families calculated their needs based on experience, estimating how much fuel would be consumed per day and multiplying by the length of the winter. This calculation was not precise. A particularly cold winter would require more fuel. A mild winter would leave a surplus. But over the years, families developed a sense of how much to gather, adjusting based on the previous year's experience. The daily use of fuel was carefully controlled. Fires were lit twice a day, morning and evening, coinciding with meal preparation. Each fire burned for 1 to 2 hours, long enough to cook the food and heat the Kang. After that, the fire was allowed to die down and the embers were banked, covered with ash to preserve them for the next lighting. Banking the embers was an important skill. If done correctly, the embers would remain hot for hours, making it easier to restart the fire without needing to use precious tinder or flint. If done incorrectly, the embers would extinguish, requiring the fire to be built from scratch. The amount of fuel added to each fire was also regulated. Too little, and the Kang would not heat sufficiently. Too much, and fuel would be wasted, burned for no additional benefit. The person responsible for managing the fire learned to judge the correct amount by observing the temperature of the Kang surface and the behaviour of the smoke. This daily fire management was typically the responsibility of the women of the household, though older children might assist. It was a task that required attention, but not constant vigilance. Once the fire was established and the fuel added, it could be left to burn while other work was done. The efficiency of the Kang system meant that a small amount of fuel could provide warmth for many hours. Modern studies have estimated that a well-designed Kang can reduce a building's heating load by 50 to 80%, compared to attempting to heat the entire volume of the room with a simple open fire. This efficiency was not accidental. It was the result of centuries of refinement, of countless small adjustments made by builders and users seeking to get the most warmth from the least fuel. The reliance on agricultural waste for fuel also created a direct link between the productivity of the fields and the comfort of the home. A good harvest meant not only more food, but also more fuel. A poor harvest meant both hunger and cold. This link reinforced the importance of agricultural practices. Farmers were incentivized to maximize not just the grain yield, but also the total biomass produced. Varieties of crops that produced thick, sturdy stalks were favored, as they provided better fuel than those with thin, fragile stems. The recycling of Kang bricks as fertilizer completed the loop. The minerals from the burned stalks were deposited in the adobe, and the adobe eventually returned those minerals to the soil, supporting the next cycle of growth. This closed system was sustainable as long as the population remained stable and the climate did not shift dramatically. It was a balance, delicate but resilient, maintained through the collective effort of the community. When the balance was disrupted, by war, by famine, by natural disaster, the consequences were severe. Without fuel, families could not cook or stay warm. Winter became a deadly threat, and survival depended on the ability to find alternative sources of heat or to endure the cold through sheer physical hardship. But in normal years, the system worked. Fuel was collected, stored, rationed, and used with care. The fire was tended, the Kang was warmed, and the family survived another winter. In the next chapter, we will look at the social structure of the Kang, at how the platform shaped the interactions and hierarchies of the household. The Kang was not merely a functional object, it was a social space. Because it was the warmest place in the home, and often the only heated surface, the entire family gathered there. Meals were eaten sitting cross-legged on the Kang. Work was done with materials spread across its surface. Conversations happened while people reclined against the wall or leaned on padded cushions. And at night the family slept there, side by side, sharing the warmth. This collective use of the Kang created a physical closeness that shaped family relationships. There was no privacy in the modern sense, no separate bedrooms for individuals. Everyone was present, visible, audible. The boundaries between personal space and shared space were minimal. Within this closeness, however, there was still structure. The Kang was not occupied randomly. Specific positions on the platform were assigned to specific individuals, reflecting the social hierarchy of the household. The warmest spot on the Kang was at the end closest to the stove, where the hot smoke first entered the platform. This position was reserved for the eldest members of the family, typically the grandparents. They held the place of highest status and received the greatest comfort. The next warmest positions, moving away from the stove, were given to the parents, the primary working adults of the household. They needed to be well rested and healthy to perform the labour that sustained the family, so they were accorded a significant degree of warmth and comfort. Further from the stove, where the temperature was cooler, the younger generation slept. Children occupied the farthest positions, where the Kang was least warm. This arrangement was not considered harsh, but natural. Children generated more body heat than the elderly, and they were more resilient to cold. This gradient of warmth mirrored the gradient of age and responsibility. It was a visible, tangible manifestation of the family structure, reinforced every night as people took their places. guests presented a unique situation. When a visitor arrived, especially during winter, the host would invite them to come up on the Kang. This phrase, Shankang, was a standard expression of hospitality. It offered warmth, comfort, and a place of honour. The position given to a guest depended on their status. An important visitor, an elder from another family, or a respected scholar might be seated in the warmest area, even displacing the household's own elders temporarily. A friend or neighbour of similar status to the host would be given a position appropriate to that relationship. This spatial negotiation was subtle, but understood by all parties. To offer someone a warm place on the Kang was to show respect and care. To accept that place was to acknowledge the host's generosity. The Kang also served as the centre of household activities during the long winter evenings. With no electric light and only a single oil lamp for illumination, there was little to do after the sun set. Work that required good visibility was impossible. Instead, the family gathered on the Kang to talk, to tell stories, to share the events of the day. These gatherings were informal but regular. They were a time for the transmission of knowledge, for elders to teach younger family members about farming techniques, about local history, about the proper way to conduct oneself in various social situations. Children learned by listening, absorbing information through repetition and observation. They heard the same stories multiple times, and through this repetition they internalized the values and expectations of the community. The Kang also hosted practical work. Women might mend clothing or prepare materials for the next day's cooking. Men might sharpen tools or repair household items. These tasks were done with hands, but accompanied by conversation, creating a blend of labour and social interaction. The enforced proximity of the Kang could also create tension. In a small space with limited privacy, conflicts had nowhere to hide. Disagreements between family members were immediately visible to everyone. The resolution of these conflicts became a collective concern, not a private matter between individuals. This lack of privacy functioned as a form of social regulation. Behaviour that might be tolerated in isolation was moderated by the presence of others. Anger had to be controlled, disputes had to be negotiated, compromises had to be reached. The Kang imposed a discipline of coexistence. At the same time, the Kang fostered intimacy. The physical closeness of sleeping together, of sharing warmth, created bonds that were difficult to replicate in more dispersed living arrangements. Family members were attuned to each other's rhythms, aware of each other's needs and moods. This intimacy extended to the management of the shared resources. Everyone knew how much fuel was available, how cold the night was, how warm the Kang felt. Decisions about adding more fuel or layering extra bedding were made collectively through unspoken agreement or brief consultation. The Kang also shaped the experience of sleep itself. Because multiple people shared the surface, their movements and sounds were part of the nighttime environment. A child turning in sleep, an elder coughing, the rustle of someone adjusting their quilt. All of these were normal, expected, part of the background of the night. This shared sleep environment was different from the isolated sleep of modern bedrooms. It was communal, continuous with the waking life of the household. Sleep was not a withdrawal from the family, but an extension of togetherness into the hours of darkness. For young children, this was comforting. They were never alone, never separated from the security of their parents and grandparents. The warmth and presence of others made it easier to fall asleep and to remain asleep through the night. For adults, the shared sleep could be less restful. The movements and noises of others sometimes disrupted their sleep. But this was accepted as normal, part of the condition of a life. The priority was warmth and safety, not individual comfort. The hierarchical arrangement of the Kang also had practical implications for health. The elderly, who were more vulnerable to cold, were protected by the warmest position. Children, who were more prone to restlessness during sleep, were placed at the edge where their movements would least disturb others. This spatial organisation was not rigid. It could be adjusted based on circumstances. If someone was ill, they might be moved to a warmer spot to aid recovery. If a guest stayed overnight, the usual arrangement would be modified to accommodate them. But in general, the pattern held. The Kang was a structured space, and that structure reflected and reinforced the social order of the household. In the next chapter, we will explore the spiritual dimension of the fire and the stove, examining the rituals and beliefs that surrounded the source of warmth. The stove was not merely a tool, it was sacred. In traditional Chinese belief, the stove was the dwelling place of the kitchen god, known as Zaoshen or Zaojun. This deity was responsible for overseeing the household, monitoring the behaviour of family members, and reporting their conduct to the higher gods. The kitchen god was depicted as a stern but benevolent figure, often portrayed in paintings or paper prints that were affixed to the wall above the stove. He was usually shown seated, sometimes accompanied by his wife, surrounded by symbols of abundance and prosperity. His primary duty was observation. Throughout the year he watched over the family, noting their virtues and their failings. He paid attention to how they treated each other, how they managed their resources, whether they performed their duties with diligence and respect. Once a year, on the eve of the Lunar New Year, the kitchen god was believed to ascend to heaven to deliver his report to the Jade Emperor, the supreme deity in the Taoist pantheon. This report would influence the family's fortune for the coming year. A favourable report might bring prosperity and health. An unfavourable one could result in hardship. To ensure a positive report, families performed a ritual known as sending off the kitchen god. This ritual took place a few days before the new year, usually on the 23rd or 24th day of the 12th lunar month. The ritual began with offerings placed before the image of the kitchen god. These offerings typically included sweet foods, sticky rice cakes, candied fruits, honey or sugar. The sweetness served a symbolic purpose. It was meant to sweeten the god's words when he made his report, or, in some interpretations, to glue his mouth shut so he could not speak ill of the family. Incense was lit, and the family would bow before the stove, expressing gratitude for the warmth and sustenance it had provided throughout the year. They would ask for the kitchen god's continued protection and for his mercy in the report he would deliver. After the prayers and offerings, the paper image of the kitchen god was carefully removed from the wall. It was taken outside and burned, the flames sending the god's spirit upward to heaven. The burning was done with respect, the family watching as the paper turned to ash and smoke rose into the night sky. With the kitchen god gone, the household entered a period of intense cleaning and preparation for the new year. The stove itself was scrubbed, the ash and soot from the year's fires removed. The entire home was swept and tidied, symbolically purging the old year's accumulated dirt and misfortune. On New Year's Day, after the kitchen god had made his report and returned to Earth, a new image was pasted above the stove. This fresh image represented the god's renewed presence, ready to begin another year of observation. The ritual was not merely superstition. It served important social and psychological functions. It reinforced the idea that behaviour had consequences, that someone was always watching and judging. This promoted ethical conduct and discouraged actions that might harm the family or the community. It also provided a moment of reflection. The act of offering sweets and asking for favour required the family to consider their actions over the past year, to acknowledge their shortcomings and to resolve to do better. The kitchen god's association with the stove also elevated the status of the fire itself. The fire was not just a physical phenomenon, but a sacred presence, deserving of care and respect. This attitude encouraged proper maintenance of the stove and Kang, ensuring that they functioned safely and efficiently. The belief in the kitchen god was widespread across China, though specific. Practices varied by region. In some areas, the god was associated with wealth and abundance, and offerings included coins or representations of money. In others, he was primarily a guardian of domestic harmony, and offerings emphasized family unity. Regardless of the variation, the core idea remained the same. The stove was the heart of the home, and its god was the protector of the family. The spiritual dimension of the fire extended beyond the kitchen god. Fire itself was seen as a purifying force, capable of transforming raw materials into cooked food, of turning cold into warmth, of driving away darkness and danger. The lighting of the fire each morning was therefore not just a practical task, but a renewal of the household's vitality. The fire connected the family to the larger cycles of nature, to the sun's warmth, to the energy stored in plants during their growth. When the fire went out, Either through accident or neglect, it was considered inauspicious. Efforts would be made to relight it quickly, using embers borrowed from a neighbour if necessary. A cold stove was a sign of misfortune, a household without life. This reverence for fire and the stove shaped the way people interacted with these elements. The stove was kept clean not just for hygiene but out of respect. The fire was tended carefully not just for efficiency, but as an act of devotion. Children were taught from an early age to treat the stove with care, to avoid careless behaviour near the fire, to understand that this was a place of significance. These lessons were reinforced through stories of the kitchen god's watchful presence, making abstract moral principles concrete and immediate. The annual ritual cycle, with its offerings and burnings and renewals, also provided structure to the year. It marked the passage of time, the transition from one season to the next, the completion of one cycle, and the beginning of another. In a world without calendars or clocks as constant references, these ritual markers were important. They organised time, gave meaning to the progression of days, and connected the household to the broader rhythms of the agricultural calendar and the lunar months. The kitchen god, the sacred stove, the careful tending of the fire, all of these were part of the larger system that sustained life through the winter. They were not separate from the practical tasks of fuel management or Kang construction, but interwoven with them, giving those tasks deeper significance. In the next chapter, we will examine the final layer of protection against the cold, the windows and walls that sealed the dwelling and managed the flow of air and light. The warmth generated by the Kang and the shelter provided by the Yaodong would be useless if the home could not retain heat. Insulation was therefore critical, and the design of windows and walls played a central role in thermal management. In traditional northern Chinese architecture, windows were not made of glass. Glass was expensive, difficult to produce, and fragile. Instead, windows consisted of wooden lattices covered with paper. The lattice was typically made from thin strips of wood, arranged in geometric patterns. Common designs included squares, rectangles, hexagons, or more elaborate forms incorporating curves and floral motifs. The lattice provided structural support and created the framework for the paper covering. The paper used for windows was not ordinary writing paper. It was thicker, made from rice straw or other plant fibres, processed to be translucent but durable. This paper allowed light to pass through while blocking wind and providing some insulation. The paper was applied to the lattice in sheets, carefully fitted and glued or pasted in place. The installation was done from the outside so that the paper pressed against the lattice when wind blew against the window. This prevented the paper from being pushed inward and torn. Once in place, the paper window created a diffused, soft light inside the room. Direct sunlight was filtered, becoming gentle and even. This reduced glare and created a calm, restful atmosphere. The paper also provided a degree of thermal insulation. It blocked the direct flow of cold air, though it did not seal completely. Small gaps remained around the edges of the lattice, allowing for slow air exchange. This air exchange was important. In a home where fires were burning, carbon monoxide could accumulate if there was no ventilation. The paper window allowed stale air to escape gradually while admitting fresh air, maintaining a balance between warmth and air quality. To improve the durability and weather resistance of the paper, it was often treated with oil. Tung oil or other vegetable oils were brushed onto the paper, soaking into the fibres and creating a semi-waterproof coating. This treatment prevented the paper from absorbing moisture from rain or snow, which would cause it to sag and tear. Oiled paper had a slight translucency, giving it a warm amber tone when light passed through. It was more robust than untreated paper, lasting through an entire winter without needing replacement. Even with oil treatment, paper windows were not permanent. They degraded over time, weakened by exposure to sunlight, moisture, and the freeze-thaw cycles of winter. Each spring, the old paper was removed and new paper was installed, a seasonal maintenance task similar to the renewal of cotton bedding. In extremely cold weather, additional measures were taken to improve insulation. Some households hung thick cloth curtains inside the windows, creating a second barrier against the cold. Others stuffed the gaps around the window frame with rags or straw, sealing every potential draft. The walls of the home also played a role in thermal retention. In surface-built homes, Walls were typically constructed from adobe bricks or rammed earth, materials with high thermal mass. During the day, when the sun shone on the exterior walls, they absorbed heat. At night, they released this heat slowly into the interior. This thermal mass effect was modest compared to the Yaodong's deep earth insulation, but it still contributed to overall comfort. The thicker the walls, the greater the thermal mass, and the more stable the interior temperature. In the Yaodong, the walls were simply the loess itself, meters thick and naturally insulated. Additional wall treatments were minimal, usually just a layer of plaster to prevent erosion and to seal the surface against moisture. Acoustic insulation was also a consideration, though it was addressed through different means. In surface-built homes, thick walls and small windows reduced the transmission of sound, creating a quieter interior. In the Yaodong, the earth provided exceptional sound insulation, as we have already seen. But traditional builders also used other techniques to manage sound, both to enhance privacy and to improve security. One such technique involved the use of large ceramic jars or urns. These were buried in the ground near the perimeter of the property, with their openings facing upward or inward. The hollow interiors of the jars acted as resonating chambers, amplifying the sound of footsteps or movements on the surface above. This system served as an early warning device. Someone approaching the house at night would create vibrations in the ground, which the jars would amplify. A person inside, especially if they were awake and attentive, could hear these amplified sounds and be alerted to the presence of a visitor or intruder. The same principle could be inverted to create sound insulation. By stacking empty jars with their openings facing inward, a barrier was created that absorbed and scattered sound waves, preventing them from travelling through walls or floors. These techniques were not universal, but were known and used in areas where security was a concern or where privacy was valued despite the close quarters of communal living. The management of light, air, sound, and temperature through windows and walls was part of the holistic approach to creating a livable winter environment. Each element, the Kang, the Yaodong, the clothing, the fuel, the windows, contributed to the overall system. The system worked because each element was designed with an understanding of the others. The paper window allowed for ventilation, which was necessary because the Kang produced smoke. The thick walls retained heat, which reduced the amount of fuel needed to maintain warmth. The Yaodong's earth insulation complemented the Kang's radiant heating, creating a stable baseline temperature that the Kang could build upon. This integration was not the result of a single plan or a centralized design process. It emerged over centuries as families experimented, observed, and adapted. Each generation inherited a set of practices from the previous one, tested them against their own experience, and passed them on with modifications. The result was a vernacular architecture and lifestyle that was deeply attuned to the specific conditions of northern China. It could not be easily transplanted to other regions with different climates or resources. It was a solution tailored to its place, refined by time and necessity. In the final chapter, we will reflect on the broader meaning of this system, on what it reveals about the relationship between humans and their environment, and on the lessons it offers for our own time.